Great. So welcome to my talk called You're the First DevRel at Your Company. Now what? First, a little bit about me, in case you didn't catch the introduction. So my name is Jaime Lopez Jr. You can find me on Twitter as @DevWithAHair, also on GitHub as DevWithAHair. So if you're looking to connect after the conference talk and ask more questions, reach out on Twitter. Or if you're interested in the presentation slides, they're actually already there on GitHub. So go check those out, please. Take notes, follow along. If you want to go back and see something that I might have said and you were wondering, that's really helpful. Again, DevWithAHair on Twitter as well as GitHub. And I'm also been a co-host of a technical podcast for the past little bit over 6 years called More Than Just Code, where we talk a lot about mobile development and culture and technology and more than just the code. That's at mtjc.fm. So let's start out with my own personal path to developer relations. How did I end up in DevRel? It actually really wasn't that long ago that I started my path, if I'm being honest. Back at DevRelCon Tokyo 2019, so somewhere like February, March of last year, the organizers at DevRelCon Tokyo opened up a call for presentations, call for papers, CFP, where they said, we're interested in developer relations professionals who can come and talk to our audience and help teach people things. And I was an iOS engineer at the time, so I wasn't part of DevRel, but I said, I've been teaching developers technical content and topics via my podcast, via the More Than Just Code podcast. And I said, why don't I take a chance? Maybe they'll accept my session. And they did. And I was very, very excited to go and present and meet so many wonderful people at the conference who are actual DevRel professionals, and also, of course, get to attend many of the sessions and learn a bunch of things. And that went really well. And I came back from the conference and said, wow, I just really wish that I had an opportunity to do that as, not just as a hobby like I would do with the podcasting, but also be able to do it as something that, as a profession, as my job. And I actually did get an opportunity. So sometime in June or July, I want to say it was, I got an opportunity to join a company here in the USA called Jack Henry, which, if you're not familiar with that company, what it does is it creates technology for the financial services industry. So mostly helping small community banks and credit unions build great, incredible online digital banking experiences here in the USA. And they were hiring their first and at the time only developer advocate. So this was an opportunity for me to start from the real ground floor and become their first DevRel person at the company. And I, decided to interview and explain some of the things that I had done as an individual and the things that I had learned at DevRelCon Tokyo. And I was very fortunate to get hired and join and, understand that I now had this new responsibility. And after I was done being so very, very happy of wow, I'll be able to turn something that I'm, getting so much interest in and beginning to be so passionate about and turn that into what I could actually do as a job at work. I thought, wow, that's great. But then after a while, I thought, now what? I mean, I'm just so fresh and new to this profession, and now I end up having to be the only one without a whole lot of guidance from others or a whole lot of structure. And that really takes me to sort of the first thing that I had to do myself, And something I'd recommend for you, which is you have to develop, or you have to figure out your developer community. You really have to determine it. I think this is probably going to be true for even experienced DevRel professionals, that they switch from one job to another, one company to another. But for somebody who is starting fresh and new, you absolutely need to understand who is your developer community. Who are these people that make up your community? Because it will differ, and the answers for what your DevRel program might look like will vary a lot based on what you are dealing with for that company. So some examples, is the company that you're at consumer facing? Is it something that people might have personal experience with, like a social networking service, an SNS? Is it an enterprise focused product where you're really trying to connect one business to another business? Is it single platform? Like, is it just for iOS? Is it just for Android or just the web? Is it perhaps multiple platforms? Maybe it's available on all of those. Maybe it's based on one particular programming language or one framework, or maybe it's based on a whole bunch of the most popular ones. And something that you might see, at a place that does things that are very consumer facing, like, let's say like Facebook or Twitter, won't necessarily apply the same way if you were trying something at Microsoft or Cisco, right? Like all of those things are going to vary, and their DevRel programs are going to vary. So one of the first things that I had to think about and really, try to make very, very solid in my mind was, did I have the facts and data? And then for you, do you have the facts and data in front of you? Like, has there been a lot of analysis that you can see, oh, I know exactly who our customers are. I know exactly who our community members are. That's great. I mean, that's a great place to be in. For me, this was an existing online banking product that was powered by RESTful web APIs and was now opening up a integration program, developer program, where we are opening up the APIs that power the product. So it's not a new product, but it is a new way to think about the company and how to integrate with it. So we didn't have a whole lot of facts and data about, well, how would developers want to integrate with our APIs? So I had to go out and get that and try to understand that. So when you're starting out without any facts and data, like I was, you really have to do some things that do not scale, but only do that some of the time, just a little bit. When things don't scale, it means that you're just never going to catch up to the full amount of things that are out there to do. So here are some examples of things that don't scale, but yet are still important to do and to think about. So meeting with other departments, like meeting with the engineering teams and trying to really understand how is this software built? What are the pros and cons? What are the limitations that it has? What are the great features that it has? And also meeting with the product team is very important, because you want to understand, well, what is the business context for this? How do we sort of expect people to use this? And I've also listed management in here. And even though it's a little bit strange to think of them as a department, it's still very important for DevRel folks to understand how management is thinking about what DevRel's role is in the company. I happen to be very fortunate that the head of engineering, which is where I report through in the organization, is very, very much in line with what we're expecting to do and has, great support for the DevRel team. I do know of other colleagues in other companies who are sort of always wondering, what does management think? Are we going to lose budget? Are we going to have budget cut back? And just at least getting out there and understanding what management is looking to get from, the DevRel role is going to make your life a lot easier, and you're going to be a lot less stressed, and you'll be better aligned with what is it that the company is looking to do and how your role can help that. And of course, the other part that you might want to consider is, of course, meeting with customers. Like if you can find who those potential customers are, or in my case, we had existing customers that we thought might become people who would use the API. That was a great opportunity. Again, it doesn't scale. I mean, if I'm meeting with one department, it means I'm not meeting with another department, right? Because there's only so many different places it can be at once. If I'm meeting with one customer, it means I'm not meeting with a different customer, right? Because, I've got that time slot taken up already. So again, these are things that don't scale. They are important. They're things that you want to do very strategically because you want to get a lot of value out of a very, very small amount of time that's being spent. So if those are things that don't scale, what about things that do scale? Well, you want to do those things that scale, and you want to do them the vast majority of the time. These are things you spend a very little bit amount of time on, and yet you see a lot of benefit from. For example, some things that scale and scale really well are, number one is, of course, documentation. So things like your API reference. If developers out in the community want to understand how do we authenticate with your API, you can point them to the API reference. Or if you say, well, I'm unclear if this step is first and then this step, what's the order I should be doing these things in? That's what a guide will tell them, and they can read themselves and they can self-service that knowledge without you necessarily being there and having to explain to them live in a meeting, right? Or sending them an email. They can read the documentation out on your developer docs site. And for the developers who are very eager and excited to learn about your company's offering, but who really don't know where to start, well, tutorials are perfect for that because it helps teach them some of the basic concepts. And again, you end up having to create these things, of course. But once you do, those things can be reused many, many, many times, right? Going back to the things that don't scale, you might have met one time with the customer and explained how these things work. That's great. That doesn't help the customer who wasn't in on that meeting. But if you have documentation and really good documentation and also example code, well, you can share that information with them, or even better, if your stuff is publicly available, people can find it themselves and answer a lot of their own questions. And I really do think that example code is one of those sort of really great secret things that you can do to help scale what you're doing as a DevRel professional, because while there is a lot of value in having solid guides and tutorials and API reference, you're still writing things out to say, do this step, then do this step, and then do this other thing. And sometimes it's a whole lot easier to say, well, here are the 5 lines of code that you would need to authenticate into our API. Here are the 3 lines of code you would need to grab accounts data, or whatever makes sense for your case. So again, you really want to focus on those things that are going to scale, because if you were like me, where you were the one and only DevRel professional, I really couldn't meet with everyone. And honestly, I don't know that it's really possible for a DevRel professional to meet everyone. I mean, is there any DevRel team out there that's 10,000, 100,000, a million DevRel team members? Probably not, but you could very easily have 10,000, 100,000, a million users. And you're going to have to find a way to support them all while having a much smaller time and energy and budget. So as you might have guessed, of course, there were big challenges as I made this transition into going into DevRel. And it really sort of boils down into 2 different areas that were challenging for me. The first kind was technical. I do have a software development background, but that only goes so far. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in some coming slides. And there's non-technical things as well that might be a little bit surprising to you out there. So let's talk about both of those. Let's talk about the technical aspects, which parts were challenging. Well, as I mentioned, I do have a software development background, but not necessarily in the topic that I happen to be doing DevRel for. So my background has been spending the last, 10 years or so as a mobile engineer, so working on iOS apps and Android apps and some web apps as well. But for this company and what I've been really focused on as a developer advocate has been doing DevRel for a RESTful web-based API, which, yes, I did use APIs as a mobile engineer. I wasn't necessarily focused on the designs of them, nor in how they can be composed together to do different things outside of what the application product I was working on was. So that was a bit of a challenge in terms of having to learn a lot about how OAuth and OpenID Connect and encryption and cryptography happen to work. And I'm not like a master by any means. Don't get me wrong, but I had to learn a lot in a very, very short period of time to be successful in this. And I think that's one of the things that you will find, regardless of whatever your technical background is. When you move into DevRel, you have to get very, very good and very comfortable at not knowing everything and then having to go figure out, how can I go learn those things? How can I learn enough of what I need to be successful as a professional? So that's the technical side. But what about the non-technical aspects? So some of the big challenges that were non-technical were related to trust in other people, meaning that as an engineer, I knew that, I could just go in and fix any problem that we might have, right? Just go in. I was like, oh, customer support says this issue. Great. I don't know what it is. Let me just go in and type in and fix everything. You can't really do that in DevRel. I mean, certainly there are folks who do contribute to their code bases, but it's not necessarily your focus, right? So you sort of have to learn, as I did, to let go a little bit and just trust that you bring the right information to the product and engineering teams, and they'll be able to solve the problem and have the skill to do that. And I think another thing you have to think about for DevRel is really about influence versus authority. And in my former role as a senior engineer, I tended to have a lot of authority of like, I think this is the way we should do it, and therefore this is the way we are going to do it. But in DevRel, that's not necessarily true. I don't necessarily report in through those teams. I don't have the authority necessarily. So it's all about influence and convincing people that this is the right thing to do, that the product feedback that you're bringing from the developer community is the right approach. So you really, really need to think about influence and how you can help convince others, even though you don't have necessarily authority. And really, I think what both of these sorts of non-technical challenges boil down to is relationship building. I mean, it's kind of right in the title, isn't it? Right? DevRel is short for developer relations. And so relationships are exactly what you have to know how to build and learn how to build, certainly outwards towards the developer community, but also inwards towards your product and engineering teams, and really being able to build partnerships across both sides. So those are the challenges, and those are the things I had been dealing with for the past year and a half or so. And you might be wondering, okay, great. How did it go? What was the result? Well, the result was Yes, manse, yatta. However you say things went great. Very, very good for my first role here, where I had successful initiatives and happy customers. And actually, fairly recently, after speaking with management, they were excited about some of the things that I was able to do, and we made the team bigger. We hired another developer relations professional. Instead of just one, there's now two. So we've doubled our capacity. So those are the things that I'm hoping you might have learned and picked up from my experience, and how you can be successful when you're the only one and you kind of don't have a lot of support. I do think there are some learning resources out there that will make things easier for you. Certainly, these learning resources made things easier for me. As an example, you've got this great book by Mary Thengvall called The Business Value of Developer Relations. You can get this online from your, like Amazon or local e-commerce shop, or probably there's a decent chance that your library might have this. I highly recommend this. This is probably the book you would probably want to have if you are just starting out in developer relations, or even if you've been in developer relations for a while, but we're kind of looking for how do you think of things cohesively and strategically. So highly recommend that book. I also recommend checking out the DevRel Collective. I've got the link there, devrelcollective.fun. This has got a whole bunch of great resources, including a Slack group that has all sorts of info on developer relations. And the Slack group is really great to communicate with other professionals and ask, very sort of interesting questions that people can answer based on their experience. Of course, DevRelCon, they usually have several events around the world. You may have seen this year's event that was combined into the several weeks long multinational World Earth event. And of course, DevRel Asia, thank you to the organizers for putting this together so that we can share knowledge with each other and can help build connections. So that's my talk. My name is Jaime Lopez Jr. You can find me on Twitter as @DevWithAHair if you want to ask more questions. You can find me also on GitHub as DevWithAHair. The slides are up there in case you wanted to reference anything. If you're interested, check out my podcast, More Than Just Code, at mtjc.fm. And thank you.